Who was Marc Chagall? He was a Russian artist of the 20th century. He was born Moishe Zakharovich Chagall in 1887 in Peskovatik, a little farm town in Russia. His family soon moved to a city called Vitebsk, which was a larger industrial city. His family was Jewish, and they favored the practice of Hasidism, which is described as an anti-rational movement which was founded in the 18th century. The Hasidic credo was serve God in joy, and they considered fantasy to be enlightening, while intellect, or dogmatic intellect, rules and dogma were constricting. Marc's father worked as a herring packer, and his mother ran a small grocery store. They had 7 daughters and 2 sons, so they weren't really rich, to say the least. Chagall's parents let him go to St. Petersburg in 1907 to study art because he displayed some enthusiasm and talent. There he was inspired by the old and the new. He got involved in the Union of Youth, which preached progress and newness and rejection of the old orders. But he also turned back to Russian traditions such as icons and folk art for inspiration. He was unhappy for a while in the art schools there, until he was admitted to study with Leon Bagst, who designed sets for Russian ballet that were wildly colored and expressionistic. Unfortunately, this was a time of great restrictions toward Jews, and in order to even be in St. Petersburg, Chagall had to say he was making deliveries for his dad's herring business. In 1910, Chagall moved to Paris, the first of many times he would move there. There he met Picasso and other Cubists, but he didn't like Cubism. He said it was too optical, and he preferred his own interior reality of dreams to the seen world. In Paris, Chagall moved to a place called La Ruche, which was a commune for Polish and Russian refugee artists. It was nicknamed the Beehive because it was round. There he started making friends, and a lot of them were poets. They started to describe his work as literary because it contains a lot of characters and little scenes, and it seems like narrative work. He didn't like that label, and he said his work had its own existence as art and wasn't just a series of symbols describing something. Still, they called him poetic a lot, and he always made friends with poets. In the teens, Chagall moved to back to Russia, and got married to his true love, a woman named Bella Rosenfeld, who was from a wealthier family than him. There he had a lot of success with exhibitions and making a monograph of his art. He also had a lot of unhappiness. Oftentimes he ran out of materials, had to paint on cardboard or tablecloths. He had to take an office job in St. Petersburg, and he thought it was soul-killing. Tell me about it. After the Bolshevik victory in 1917, the new communist government offered Chagall the position of Director of Fine Arts for the Ministry of Culture in USSR. However, he rejected that powerful position. He did accept the Commissar of Fine Arts in Vitebsk, and he even employed Casimir Malevich. Malevich, painter of extreme paintings. They were really futuristic for the time, 1917. Extremely minimalistic, geometric, and he called his style suprematism. Elizitsky was also an extremely modernist artist who designed abstract geometric sculptures. Malevich and Elizitsky considered themselves to be artists of the revolution, and they thought Chagall was bourgeois. Chagall, meanwhile, thought Malevich and Elizitsky were fanatics. So Chagall moved to Moscow with his wife Bella and his daughter around 1922. Lenin had declared avant-garde art childish and subversive. He favored socialist realism with its glorification of the state and its leaders. And this would happen again and again under Stalin and Hitler and Mao, that art would be declared indulgent or bourgeois. That's the early examples of cancel culture, I guess you could say. Poor and unemployed, Chagall took a job teaching homeless children. There he wrote an odd, ecstatic fantasy autobiography called My Life. During this time, Chagall was so poor he could not even paint. His family was finally able to move back to Paris in 1923. And there he started painting some memories of Russia, what it had been before communism took over. Back in Paris, Chagall learned woodcut and etching techniques, and he illustrated books. He had a big break when he got commissioned to illustrate the Bible. This sparked a lifelong obsession of his with biblical themes in his art. Chagall traveled to Palestine in 1931 for inspiration. Since the beginning of modernism, biblical themes had been relegated to Christmas cards. In other words, the Bible was always a strong theme in art during the Renaissance and the Baroque and prior to about the 18th century. Then when modernism came about, all the revolutions, the ending of the monarchies, the demotion of the church in people's lives, biblical themes were also demoted in art, and they were relegated to paintings for people's houses, devotional pieces for personal devotion, and small images such as Christmas cards or books. They were no longer on the big major canvases of art. Now those canvases were used for abstract scenes and expressionism, no longer depicted biblical scenes. Anyway, Chagall always resisted the mainstream and went ahead and kept painting biblical themes, integrating them into his art. In fact, he had resisted all the modernist movements, Cubism, Futurism, and even Surrealism. He chose instead to paint scenes with people and animals and telling stories. He loved storytelling in his art, although he resisted the description that his art was narrative or poetic. He continued to paint in the south of France until events in Europe convinced him in the late 30s that it was not a good idea for him to stay. And so he took his family and moved to New York, like so many other Jews did at the onset of World War II. Arriving in New York on June 23, 1941, Chagall saw many of his old Paris cafe buddies, Piet Mondrian, Max Ernst, and Fernand Léger. They were excited to be in Manhattan with the tall buildings and all the rushing cars and trains. Chagall, instead, aware of the horrors taking place overseas, was more somber, and he bonded with a circle of Jewish friends, and they kind of looked inward at this time. In 1944, Chagall's beloved wife Bella died. She had been writing a book about their romance in Vitebsk called Burning Lights. Chagall was forlorn for many months after her death. When he finally could paint again, he was painting in grays and dark colors, and there were always images of Bella throughout. The death of his wife and the Holocaust had literally drained his work of color for a long time. After the Russian Revolution, after World War II, he always returns to Paris. He said, "My heart needs Paris like a tree needs water." Eventually, he was able to move down to the Côte d'Azur, the Azure Coast, down in the French Riviera. That seems to have been a colony for rich and famous artists because Henri Matisse and Picasso also lived there, the Côte d'Azur. In the 1950s, Chagall began working with ceramics and glass and mosaics and tapestries, many other media, which he did really well. His artistic skills just translated through all media. He had his old Bible illustrations published, and he started wanting to produce more permanent work and outdoor work. So he started decorating churches and buildings with paintings and stained glass. And his paintings lent themselves really well to stained glass. It always had a lot of color, a lot of light effects. He created many windows in France, Jerusalem, and New York. He was also commissioned to do biblical scenes for the Knesset, or the Israeli Parliament, and the Hadassah Hospital in Jerusalem. In 1964, Chagall was invited to paint the ceiling of the Paris Opera House. Now, this is one of my favorite works by him. It's like a little kid came and scribbled all over the top ceiling of this really old, ornate, heavy building. It's so whimsical and colorful, and he gets all the great musicians in there. Mozart, Beethoven, Debussy, Tchaikovsky. It's really just like the childlike excitement that characterizes his work, and I love it. It wasn't really popular at the time, though. The Paris Opera House. Some artists get a retrospective of their life, like a gallery exhibit just devoted to them, and that's an honor. But Chagall got an entire museum devoted to him. Marc Chagall Museum of the Biblical Message opened in 1973 in Nice, France. This museum contains many large paintings of his of the Old Testament, as well as his mosaics, tapestries, and stained glass. It's so amazing. The work is so beautifully displayed. Just go look at a video on it and you'll see. Around this time, things got a little complicated based on his interpretation of art within his Jewish religion. He did sometimes use the figure in his religious art, and the figure is forbidden in Jewish religious art. He never used figurative images in Jerusalem, but he did use them in Europe, which didn't sit too well with the Jewish leaders. And they also said that he was depicting the Old Testament from a Christian point of view. Chagall said he was painting for universal brotherhood and love. So Chagall died in 1985, and he was 97. He died in his home in the Azure Coast in France. How many paintings and works did he create? According to wikiart.org, he created about 1,022 works. Not bad. He was prolific. He was described as a painter of fantasy, dreams, and interior vision. Other earlier painters of fantasy were Goya and Fuseli. Later, rationalism and the scientific revolution drove myth and religion into the underground. Other artists, such as, of course, Dali and de Chirico, also painted fantasy and dreams, although Chagall didn't like to associate himself with the Surrealists. Still, you could kind of see the comparison. Personally, I say that Chagall was a visionary painter. He was painting from within. A lot of artists sit and look at something like Monet. He looked at those bridges and trees and gardens and painted it. But Chagall looked within himself for the images in his paintings. He still made them look really good. They're not just slapped down like stickers. They all are related to one another in his paintings. And he had the perspective and the color and all the other artistic properties just right. So what are some facts about Marc Chagall? I think his work could really be compared to children's book illustrations. Many of his works are very whimsical, with mysterious scenes and gentle animals and childlike lines and shapes and bright colors. They would be perfect illustrations for a children's book. And I think children's book illustrations are one of the great forms of art. They inspire children to want to look at art, to want to hear stories. Some of my favorite children's book illustrators are really great artists. Quentin Blake, Richard Scarry, and Katie MacDonald Denton are some of my favorites. And Chagall did book illustrations himself. He illustrated the Bible and 1001 Arabian Nights. And I imagine that children loved looking at those illustrations. If you want to get your children into art, just show them the works of Marc Chagall. Was Marc Chagall well dressed? It actually says that he often wore striped painter's smocks and wool pants, so he really looked the part of the artist. And he himself admitted to using a touch of makeup to enhance his doe-like features. So some paintings that you want to take a look at to get an idea of his works are The Sabbath, 1910, an early work by him. It's in the Wallraf Richards Museum in Cologne. It depicts his early days in Paris, and he was homesick for Vitebsk, but also impressed by this new guy, Van Gogh. And he was copying Vincent's style. It reminds me a lot of Van Gogh's painting of his bedroom. It's a depiction of after the Sabbath meal. Everybody looks stuffed and bored and falling asleep. There's a man sitting by the door who looks like he's screaming with agony, but I think that's just the way his beard is painted. And I like the way the clock and the lamp are painted. Paris Through the Window, from 1911 at the Guggenheim. It's right after he moved to Paris, and you can see how enraptured he is by the city. There's a man hanging from the building. I don't know quite why. He gets the rooftops in there. And then there's a man at the windows who's so excited by Paris, he can't decide whether to look at the city or his interior with his human-faced pet cat. And I also like the way everything in the painting is a gradient from white to very colorful color. It's a really fun, childlike painting. The Green Violinist from 1923 at the Guggenheim Museum. And this is a classic sort of Fiddler on the Roof theme. I guess fiddlers were a common scene in Vitebsk, Russia when Chagall grew up. And his uncle played fiddle. According to Chagall, Uncle Noik played badly but enthusiastically. Some quotes by Marc Chagall. He said, "I did not see the Bible. I dreamed it." He also said, ever since early childhood, I've been captivated by the Bible. On painting, he said, Nothing can be done with a single line. You must triple or quadruple it and get the shading. He said, I don't understand all my pictures. They're not literature. They're merely a pictorial arrangement of images that obsess me. And very soberingly, he wrote, dogma means separation, and separation means conflict, struggle, hate, and war. But Chagall's work should leave you on a happy note. It is a joyful and spiritual and loving body of work.